As many viewers of this channel remember, and as I remember from going there multiple times during these protests, Standing Rock was a pivotal watershed moment in history for indigenous rights, for environmental rights, for political protests, for the fight against corporate power, for the fight for our planets. Almost a year ago, on February 23, 2017, the Oceti-Sakowin camp was raided by heavily militarized police after a newly inaugurated President Trump reversed President Obama's decision to deny Energy Transfer Partners a permit to finish the construction of the nearly $3.7 billion project, the Dakota Access Pipeline. The water protectors ceremoniously burned the camp. They had been ordered to leave by February 22nd, and those who didn't were arrested that day. Dozens were, adding to the around 800 people charged with crimes since the camp was first formed. During this time, as The Intercept famously or infamously reported, the North Dakota police teamed up with the mercenary firm hired by Energy Transfer Partners called TigerSwan. The firm did opposition research on the protesters using heavy militarization and aerial surveillance in going after them. Internal TigerSwan communications described the movement as an ideologically driven insurgency with a strong religious component and compared the anti-pipeline water protectors to jihadist fighters. One report dated February 27, 2017 states that since the movement generally followed the jihadist insurgency model while active, we can expect the individuals who fought for and supported it to follow a post-insurgency model after its collapse. They compared them to jihadists and treated them as such. This mercenary company does most of their work overseas with terrorist organizations, so of course they're going to treat water protectors like terrorists. They were hired to do so, I guess. Me giving these details is a long way to say that, while many progressives and people with hearts and minds see that these tactics are fascistic, cruel, and immoral, many states have seemingly taken what happened in North Dakota as an example and have decided to apply it to their own states. The International Center for Not-for-Profit Law has been tracking similar laws that have cropped up since Standing Rock. 58 anti-protest bills have been introduced in 31 states since Standing Rock. 8 of them have already been enacted, 28 are pending, and 22 have been defeated or just expired, so they weren't put into law. The states that have enacted them: Florida, Oklahoma, North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, South Dakota, and of course, North Dakota. What we saw in the last legislative session was a surprising and unusual surge in anti-protest legislation, which went after those fundamental rights to go outside, speak out, and dissent, said Vera Eidelman, a fellow with the American Civil Liberty Union's Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project. The sheer number of anti-protest bills that have been introduced, along with the heavy-handed policing of demonstrators on the ground, points to a trend towards the criminalization of dissent, spanning from Standing Rock to the 194 people, including journalists, who face felony charges and up to 70 years in prison for protesting Trump's election. That is a reference to the J20 protesters, who I'd be remiss if I didn't mention. They were facing prosecution for dissent, and they're facing years in prison for protesting Trump at his inauguration. According to Eidelman, most of the legislation appeared to be written in response to the most successful mass protests in recent years, particularly those implicating oil and gas infrastructure and racial justice demonstrations that often block traffic as a tactic. A bill introduced in Colorado would have tightened penalties for tampering with oil and gas equipment. A similar measure signed into law in Oklahoma dramatically increased the penalties for trespassing in areas containing a crucial infrastructure facility. Tampering with such facilities now carries up to a $100,000 fine or 10 years in prison. The South Dakota legislature passed a measure in March that allows the governor or local sheriffs to ban groups of 20 or more people from public land and schools. Lawmakers in Mississippi proposed a bill to make obstructing traffic a felony punishable by 5 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. A Republican senator in Oregon introduced a bill requiring public universities and colleges to expel students convicted of rioting. Lawmakers in half a dozen states, North Dakota, North Carolina, Florida, Tennessee, Texas, and Rhode Island, introduced legislation to protect some drivers who unintentionally hit protesters with their cars. In Washington state, a Republican state senator who served as Trump's deputy campaign director recently reintroduced a bill adding a mandatory minimum sentence of 60 days to any crime that causes economic disruption, such as blocking traffic or railways. Okay, let's just stop right there. Economic disruption, right? That's where the issue lies, of course. And like the Nation article said, these laws seem to be tailored towards two kinds of protests. Economic ones, like Standing Rock, that go after oil pipelines and other activities that degrade our environment, but you're going after big money, so... And Black Lives Matter protests, which in some instances have used the tactic of blocking roadways, much like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. did with the Selma to Montgomery March. People just forget about that, MLK. And this isn't just on the state level, of course. A report released in May by the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Intelligence and Analysis on suspected environmental rights extremists emphasized the criminal and violent acts carried out by pipeline protesters. In a similar vein, the Federal Bureau of Investigation recently issued an internal report warning that black identity extremists, a novel term, motivated by racial injustice, pose a violent threat to law enforcement officers. Civil liberties experts worry these labels will be used to justify further surveillance of activists. I love how Black Lives Matter extremists are the ones posing threats to law enforcement officers who are disproportionately murdering young African American men and just people in this country. They're the threat. Anyway, since the Dakota Access Pipeline became fully functioning in June, the pipeline has leaked at least 5 times. Yet, despite the clear evidence that the protesters were correct, states are attempting to silence the protesters' accurate grievances by labeling them as violent criminals. The states where the other laws are pending, just so you know in case you want to protest them: Washington, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Ohio, Kentucky, Missouri, Minnesota, Iowa, Wyoming, Arizona, Michigan, and Alabama. Minnesota and Missouri have 3 bills pending, and a Scott Walker-run Wisconsin has 4. And again, on the federal level, in August of 2017, Trump issued an executive order giving more riot gear and military equipment to local police. The presidential executive order on restoring state, tribal, and local law enforcement's access to life-saving equipment and resources reinstates a program that transfers surplus military equipment to police departments across the country. President Obama had scaled back the 1990s-era program in 2015 following the heavily armed police response to protests against the killing of black men in Ferguson, Missouri, and elsewhere. With Executive Order 13809, President Trump restored the program, and police departments will again receive free weaponized vehicles, certain large caliber ammunition, riot gear, and other military equipment, which may once again be used when responding to protests. So, fascism is overused as a term, but when it comes to the Trump administration, I think that discussion is real. The Secretary of State in this country is a major oil executive. That's the blend of major industry, big money, and government, even more so than it already has been. And then you demonize certain groups. You've seen the way that ICE cracks down on immigrants and targeting politicians who run sanctuary cities, and even going after individuals harboring those immigrants. It's scary stuff. And then lastly, they shut down dissent, J20, Standing Rock, Black Lives Matter, etc. The Trump administration has led a smear campaign against the press and is cracking down on protesters. And you know what? The state governments are doing it too.